Hello and welcome to this Impact Cities webinar. My name is Gareth Ragg and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today on what should be an informative and lively discussion around the topic of smart city investment. I will introduce you to today's expert speakers in just a few moments' time, but it isn't on them to do all the heavy lifting today. We also want you to be part of our discussion and we want your questions. So at any point during the webinar, please drop us a question. I will then put the best of these questions to our speakers at the end of the webinar during our Q&A session. All you need to do is, if you look at your screens now, there is a box on there which is where you can put your questions. So please, at any point, put those on there and then I will put those to our speakers later. But before we kick off, just a quick reminder that this webinar is produced in the run-up to Impact Cities, taking place in 7 weeks' time in December on the 5th, 4th and 5th in Las Vegas. It is a brand new conference and expo whose mission is to connect investors, enterprises, cities and tech leaders to discuss the impacts and opportunities shaping the urban future today. We have a dedicated track on investment and partnerships, and it will cover in depth many of the topics that we'll touch on today's webinar. So, to today's expert speakers, just a quick note before we start though there. Shale from Energy Impact Partners unfortunately is no longer able to join us this morning. However, do not worry, we still have two great experts for you today. We will kick off with a presentation from Paul Asel of NGP Capital, and this will be followed by Gerd Goethe. But before we open the floor, open the floor to the discussion and take your questions after that. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Paul for his presentation. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I just want to confirm that this everybody can hear fine. With that, I'll go forward. And if you could turn the slide, I've just got 3 slides here for brief introductory remarks, and very much do look forward to your questions. First, a background on NGP Capital and how we come to this sector. We are a global fund with 1.2 billion under management. So we have operations in the United States, Europe, and China and India. So we are focused on investing in the connected world, which is the confluence of cloud, mobile, sensors, and intelligence, and how that either augments our daily personal lives or enables and transforms industries. We're focused on 3 particular sectors in digital health, transportation, logistics, and the intelligent enterprise. And with that sectoral focus, that really has what has informed us as to the smart cities area. So if you go to the next slide, I can give you some more background on that. We have made 16 investments in smart mobility, of which are approximately equally divided between transportation and smart logistics. We did not plan to enter the smart city space, but as we progressed in looking at these different industries and made these investments, we realized that increasingly cities were an important part of the calculus and the success of our businesses. And so what I've highlighted here is the companies that have active engagements with cities and with government, and actually have a government oriented function within their companies. So in the course of our doing research diligence and then on potential investments, and then working with our companies, I've had the opportunity to talk with heads of Department of Transportation of over 25 cities in the United States and Europe, including most of the major cities in the United States. And as a result of that, have developed, I think, some good insights into how cities across both US and Europe think about transportation and logistics, and also how this sector is progressing. So let's go to the next slide, and just would give you some observations on this. And I'll focus for the purpose of this discussion on the smart bikes, and that could include scooters, e-bikes, and just smart bikes. And as we were evaluating this sector, ultimately we ended up investing in Lime, and we talked with many of the cities that are located here, and just a couple observations on this is that the shared bike industry has really only developed in the last 10 years or so. And it started with Washington, D.C., with a very successful program that was launched there in 2010. It moved to New York City with a program that was launched there, I believe, around 2013, and then to Chicago around 2014-15, to Portland, Oregon. And there have been many other cities that have developed since that time. What we have found is a phase shift. If you looked at all but the Lime example here, each of these other cities were done on a collaborative basis, a one-on-one negotiation with the bike sponsor or operator. These were all docked bikes, and these were all subsidized by the city with a corporate sponsor, and these were all unbranded. And what I mean by that is, while we are showing here names like City Bike, Capital Bike Share, Bike Town, Divvy, and Ford Go Bike, the operator itself was unbranded. The corporates put their company name on this, but behind each of these were a set of operators that were largely invisible to the public. What has happened in the last couple of years is that there has been a lot of money that has moved into the transportation logistics sector. I've been investing in this space for the last 5 years, and for the first 2 years, it was really quite lonely. I was one of very few investors looking at the space. A lot of money has come in the last 3 years, and it is probably the most heavily funded space in the global markets over the last 3 years. When you think about the amounts of money that has gone into Uber, Lime, Didi Dacha, and a variety of other businesses and segments. As a result of that, the nature of the relationship with cities has changed. So previously, these were unbranded. Now they're branded. Previously, the companies that operated these were largely cash flow positive and unfunded. Now there's a lot of funding coming into the space. The nature of the economic relationship has changed. So previously, the city subsidized these programs, and now the companies themselves are going to cities and saying, look, we will fund this ourselves. It's free to you. What we would like is just access to the cities and supporting government regulations that would facilitate this. The market has previously been negotiated on a one-on-one basis with basically one party winning a city. Now it is highly competitive, and you've seen that play out in the competition between Uber and Lyft and between Lime and Bird. So as a result of that competition, it has changed the speed of the market. An example of that is San Francisco, the Ford Go Bike program. I think it's a very well thought through program. It was one that is quite distinctive from these others in that it is a program that actually brings together Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose, and other cities in between. It was also a program that took 4 years to negotiate. The companies that are coming in today are moving much more quickly. An example, we've invested in Move It, which is a multimodal transport app. They're now in over 2,000 cities. They're expanding into a new city every 1.5 days. Lime is a company that started less than 2 years ago, and yet it's in over 50 cities and is expanding into a new city every week. The other thing that we're seeing is consolidation in the markets, and previously there were single operators operating in a single mode, such as car share, ride share, bike share. Now what we're seeing is multimodal players. Examples of that are Uber buying Jump, Lyft buying Motivate. And as a result of that, so we are both the funding, the level of competition, and this consolidation in the markets is changing the dynamics with cities quite significantly. And we've seen evidence of that with Jump and then Lime and Bird going into San Francisco and putting vehicles on the streets, and then the city having to respond to that. And it's moved from a very collaborative system to one that I think is much more disruptive, which is the way a lot of these companies are accustomed to working in the private sector. My own belief is that there needs to be a middle way here, that the cities are a very important factor to consider, and that there needs to be a more collaborative approach, while at the same time finding a far more speedy process here that is going to get the services out to the customer in the time that the market allows. So those are high-level observations, and I'll turn it back to the moderator and happily answer your questions when the time comes.
Thank you very much for those insights, Paul. Just a quick reminder to everyone, keep your questions coming in for our panelists. I will then put them to the panelists in just a few moments' time after a second presentation. All you need to do is go on the screen. You'll see a box there for your questions. Type them in, and then I will put them to the guys. Okay, thank you. And we will go on to our second presentation now. With that, I'd like to pass over to Gerd Goethe, who is the founder and managing partner at Renu Ventures.
Thank you very much. I'm still working through a minor issue here. Can't go to full screen mode right now. Whatever reason, we'll get there. In the meantime, while I'm getting organized here, so Renu Ventures, in contrast to NGP, is a new fund. We are still in fundraising mode, and because of that, I actually want to show the disclaimer here in the meantime. Okay, and hopefully I'll get to where is my horrible now? Okay, anyways, I'll just keep going here. So I'll start with a little bit more of a high-level perspective on it here. When we started looking at the space, we came to realize that two of the biggest industries in the world are actually getting disrupted, and that is transportation and it's energy. And when you look at how that disruption plays out, we actually see that those increasingly get interconnected as transportation goes electric. We need to provide those loads. The grid is facing new loads. All of a sudden, the grid is facing load growth, which hasn't happened in a couple of decades. When you look, transportation is going autonomous, it is going electric. Energy is going renewable, and it's going highly decentralized and at a faster pace than we ever expected. Paul spoke a whole lot about the ride share and bike share and so on. So asset ownership is being replaced by the shared economy, and that's also a generational effect. And then you see a number of technology advancements which accelerate that transition, whether it's AI, machine learning, and deep learning, all those things. Internet of Things, connectivity, cloud edge, fog computing, blockchain, so a number of new technologies in that space that actually support and even accelerate the transition. So Renu Ventures, as I mentioned before, is a new fund, and we are focused exactly on that convergence of transportation, energy, with a heavy influence by infrastructure. When you look at where does that really play out, the cities, the smart cities, are at the very forefront of that. So in mobility, we are looking at companies that bring the new platforms, technologies, business models to the market. As you all heard from Paul, he made a great case there. There's a lot of funding going into, for example, ride-sharing companies right now. And it feels like every day you open your newsletters and you see another couple $100 million funding going into this company or that company. So that's probably not where Renu will play. Also, we will not invest in the 70th LiDAR company. And we had a conversation with one of the auto ODMs, and they said they are actually tracking 70 LiDAR companies right now. I don't think that's what the future is. I think the future is really in developing those platforms, in developing the applications, in getting in front of the consumer. And the consumer interface these days, in many cases, actually is the smartphone that we carry around with us. And then on the renewable side, I think also that is highly relevant actually for the smart cities. As you see more and more rooftop solar being deployed, community solar being deployed, that energy transition is happening in the cities, and quite often we don't even realize it. And it's the utilities like that concept because rebuilding the infrastructure, expanding the infrastructure, especially in an urban environment, has essentially become cost prohibitive. So moving on transportation, I think I can take the next 2-3 slides very quickly here. Electric vehicles taking over, and I'll show some market data around that. We all hear about autonomous and connected vehicles. I think almost all vehicles you purchase today are connected. Autonomy, some people are skeptical about it. At the same time, when you look, it's actually happening in specific areas already now. For example, May Mobility with the autonomous shuttle running in the Motor City, and they're expanding to a number of other cities very quickly. Mobility and transportation as a service, and from the early cowboy days where you would use an Uber. Not sure whether the police would actually pull you over at the airport because they don't have the proper transportation licenses, as it would happen at certain airports in certain states. I would say we've left that behind. It's taken over, and the shared economy. Paul spoke to that. As someone from the baby boomer generation, we might struggle a little bit more with that one, but instead of owning a vehicle and we select that vehicle so that it fulfills 99.99% of all our needs, we are rapidly moving to a situation where we just get the vehicle that we need for a specific need, and then we move on to whatever the next requirement is. So the asset ownership is changing there. And that is going to have profound impact on cities when you think of vehicle ownership, and vehicles most of the day are just being parked somewhere. And so as we hopefully move away from owning all our individual vehicles and have fewer vehicles which are used much more frequently, so the duty cycle will change, will hopefully free up significant space that is currently being used, I'm tempted to say wasted, for parking. On the energy side, I spoke about renewable power. The power mix is shifting quite dramatically now from fossil generation to renewable sources. The load profile is also changing rapidly. That challenges the grid, and we need new paradigms, actually, how we manage our electric power system. And that requires real-time control. It requires local control. It requires demand-side management. So a fundamental change of how we used to operate the grid, and we need different business models. We need different market models behind that to facilitate that. Where it all comes together is in the cities. And I've just highlighted a few. That list is never complete, and you can always argue what else should be included or not. Obviously, the built environment is a huge consumer of energy. We need to move between those places, so transportation is a key point. All that needs to be fed with electricity, natural gas, in some places still steam, and then you need to have water, garbage, and so on, so all the utilities. And then on the other hand, public safety is a huge challenge. Increasingly, unfortunately, we still want to enjoy our lives, so recreation, education, all those things that I've listed here. Over the last couple years, I've come to realize that urban planning actually has incredible influence, is incredibly powerful in making things happen, good things happen, or bad things happen if not done properly. The good news is, as of today, with Internet of Things, with sensors being dirt cheap, there's data available everywhere. Data is our biggest friend, potentially also our biggest enemy if we don't manage privacy and other concerns properly. So that is something where I believe a lot of action is required over the next, in the near future, to really enable business models which would be possible based on the data that we're already collecting today, just that many of the players don't have access to it yet. So that's to some extent a regulatory challenge. Probably most, if not all of you, saw the news coming out of the IPCC a week or two ago, that sobering warning that they gave all of us. The good news from my perspective is a lot of it is happening already. So I'm showing here global wind and solar installations and how we've experienced steady growth over the last couple of years, and this is forecast to continue and even further accelerate. And we have the EV sales, electric vehicles, which just crossed the 1 million mark in the United States. China is probably a little bit ahead of us. So that's the quick overview I wanted to show. It's our perspective on the market. And I leave it up to you now, Gareth. Should we immediately move into some of the main concerns that we identified previously? You want to tease that up with a couple questions?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you very much for both of those presentations. Again, as I mentioned a couple of times, if we would very happily take your questions and I'll put those to the panelists. So all you have to do is go onto your screens and type in the questions there. I'd like to go back to a moment that you were talking about there, Paul, and it's this interesting balance between the disruption and the collaboration within cities, and I wonder to elaborate a bit more and talk a bit more about that level of how do you balance the disruption and the need for speed, so to speak, in terms of actually bringing some of these services to market a lot quicker than what they previously have done. Can they be balanced, and how do we go about balancing those two factors?
I believe they can be balanced, and that is best done by focusing on the common goal that both cities and companies have, and that is serving their constituencies, the residents of the city, and for the companies, their consumers. And so it's really that shared perspective that allows for a collaborative approach. The difference there is that maybe there's a slightly different orientation in that the companies believe that the best way to demonstrate the value to consumers is to have the service offered and use that as a basis for then showing cities the benefits that this provides to their residents. Ultimately, I think what needs to be appreciated is that the cities are own the public space, and their mandate is to manage that public space, and that's something I think that needs to be appreciated by companies, and then that leads to then finding a common way to be able to manage that. What we found with cities is that, and the end users, is that this is a very happy outcome in that shared transport. It's healthy, it's green, and it's low cost, and it's significantly changing commute patterns for the better. It's it's giving consumers more options. It will tend to move cities toward and their residents toward greater use of public transport. And ultimately, we believe that this will provide less congestion and faster commute times done more cheaply. So I think that's the end potential. And then it's really a question of how we get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Have you got any thoughts on that topic of how we balance the need for disruption with the getting that relationship right with the cities?
Yeah, I would say we are lucky in the sense of there seems to be an emerging consensus that we all need to pull together, and that it requires adjusting or sometimes breaking some of the rules. So with that much more collaborative approach, I'll point you to a real life example from an investment I made in my previous life while I was at Siemens Venture Capital. We invested in ChargePoint, the electric vehicle charging stations. And when the company started, we were a Series B investor. When the company started, one of the first hurdles they had to cross was you put out a charging station and you essentially sell electricity to a consumer. So oops, that makes you an energy retailer. Are you subject to energy retail regulation in whatever jurisdiction you are in? So that was one of the first things that the company got resolved because California passed some legislation exempting charging stations from the regulation for energy retail. And you can go on from there. It's like it has influence in building codes. You have new parking regulations for EV spots, and so on and so on. So I think we've actually luckily arrived at a point where people recognize that we need to change how we've done things the last 100 years to adjust to the new world where we are in, and that gives me a lot of hope and optimism. All pointed to the examples in San Francisco, and we were talking about it earlier today, how San Francisco is trying, and a lot of municipalities, a lot of cities worldwide do that right now, how to actually have the bike sharing programs in a way that they fulfill customers and consumers' need while still maintaining accessibility of sidewalks and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of questions here that have come in. I think this is someone that's from developing, actually a company out there developing a solution at the moment. I have a question for you. So it's, what is the TRL level interesting enough for you to invest in? Being a UK startup currently developing a multimodal urban last mile autonomous platform, i.e. ground, air, maritime, it can be incredibly challenging financially speaking. So is it TRL 3, TRL 5, or TRL 9?
Yeah, I would say let's meet in the middle between 5 and 9, somewhere around 7. And that really means the technology has been tested and verified in the relevant operational environment.
Any thoughts on that, Paul?
Well, if we're talking about the autonomous space, we would say I think that it's the technology is going to be ready far quicker than consumers and regulators will be, and so it may be decades before we have full autonomous driving in the wild, but there applications that will be ready for use on a much quicker basis. We're seeing it applied in ADAS. We are going to see it applied in first and last mile solutions, both in the for example, smart buses and valet parking, and then logistics. So I think these will all be good ways for us to test and expand the systems.
I've got a great question here, which I think is a common question for many people when they decide that they actually want to start working with cities. And as we talked about, many of these ecosystems, which didn't previously have cities maybe as their center, are now converging around cities. So the question is, within cities which are interested in implementing smart systems, who is the greatest evangelist to approach as an entry point? My experience with municipal government is that they are slow to move and overwhelmed with problem solvers. So who would you recommend is that contact point in cities for people to go to first?
So I can take a first stab at that. And maybe my answer is not representative living in California and especially in the county of Marin, which is, I would claim, in many aspects at the forefront. In many cases, you actually by now have a sustainability office, and those people are always keen to explore ways how to adopt those technologies, bring them to their respective town or city or county, whatever their jurisdiction is. So they are very open-minded, but also previously in Cupertino, for example, you could even approach the mayor with it. So there was, those people were tremendously receptive, also because I think they realized that this is very popular actually with their constituents.
And we found the heads of departments of transportation to be open. I think they generally see this as I mentioned, as being green, healthy, and inexpensive. And we also see the shared transport models as being complementary to the backbone that they're developing, whether it's rail or bus or otherwise. The other group to go to would be those that are looking for equitable opportunities, and to the extent that one can address opportunities, transport opportunities for the disadvantaged, that is an area where we see a lot of traction as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So another quick question that's just come in. So it says, typically there's no positive record when investing on infrastructure projects. What has changed now, and how do you actually evaluate that as an investment opportunity? Any thoughts from anyone on that question? Looking more at that infrastructure piece, I guess.
I think there are elements of infrastructure that can be applied. So, an example is sensor overlay networks. We are seeing those as being a very important way to bring in intelligence into cities. And there are a couple of ways to do that. You can do that through the infrastructure within a city, and there will be sensors that are on vehicles and other things. So having some way of developing that is vital. The other type of perhaps new infrastructure that we'll see is data, and finding new ways to tap data and bring intelligence into systems is something that governments are increasingly interested in, and we're seeing a lot of innovation in a variety of different sectors around that, from not only transportation, but first responder systems and around fires, earthquakes, and other things.
Any thoughts, Gerd?
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of infrastructure, or I should say a lot of technology, is actually being deployed by various players in the market because they need it for their respective core business. And what we still need to improve on is actually how we make those assets available to others as well. I mean, I think Paul mentioned the keyword there. Access to the data in most cases is what is really required. And so sorting out ownership of data, how we share them, how do we maintain privacy to the extent needed, that needs to be worked out, and that will free up, I think, a lot of investment in applications and services that are based on a much broader data lake, really, where everything goes into. Other than that, we indeed still have a little bit of a challenge, I would say, between technologies being deployed or being verified in the field, but before the traditional infrastructure investors come in and in many cases then deploy enormous amounts of money, they will want to see more validation. The encouraging thing is, and I'm just going back to the rideshare model, where while it's not infrastructure as such, but there's a lot of capital being deployed to develop and ramp up those services.
So it's a really interesting point you mentioned there about that need for collaboration and sharing, essentially, with the data. But obviously, when we start looking at cities, the issue of privacy is incredibly sensitive, whichever industry we're looking at, but especially when we're talking about citizens, it becomes very sensitive as well. If we're just going to try and break through some of these silos and actually start getting all the stakeholders to share a little bit more, what do we think has got to happen in order to speed up that relationship? Because typically, sometimes to get people to play nice with each other can actually take quite a long time. So do we have any thoughts on how we can speed that up and how the ecosystem can start sharing with each other now, rather than this taking quite a while down the road to actually get to that point where we know we need to go to?
Yeah, so probably we also need some lawyers to answer that question.
Right.
But what I'm tempted to say is we need to sort through a couple of fairly basic questions. It's like, how do you anonymize data? So remove any personal attributes, so that would allow someone to trace it back to a certain individual. And then how do we actually give, for example, corporations the right to share when people enter their facilities and leave their facilities, share that with the transportation department so that they can review their bus and train schedules to optimize things like that. So I think it really comes down to just establishing a couple basic rules, making sure that data are not being misappropriated for whatever advertisement purposes, and so on and so on. Putting those basic guidelines in place, I think will already give it a boost, and then we'll definitely have to learn a lot as we go.
Sure. Paul, any thoughts on that topic?
Consumers are, to a large extent, voting with their feet, and so we've seen services like Waze and Move It have tremendous consumer traction, and they're contributing the data because it serves a broader public good, and and those have become very useful services. I had an interesting conversation with a family member not long ago, and we were talking about the release of location-based data, and the first response was, well, that's kind of spooky. And then I said, well, don't you know that with your iPhone, you're being tracked, anyway? And the response was, well, but that's different, because that's providing me a real service that I appreciate. So I think it is a matter of providing a well appreciated service, and then having incumbent upon companies as having the reputation that they're a trustworthy actor in the use of that data.
Absolutely. So to go slightly back towards the issue of regulation. So we looked at the consumer piece there, and Gerd, obviously we've been talking a bit about the pitch about transportation and mobility, but you're also looking at this with the convergence with the energy sector as well. So I just thought if I get some thoughts from yourself on the issue of regulation here, and is that actually a help, or is that a hindrance which is actually slowing down some of the innovation that we could potentially see within this space right now?
Yeah, as of today, it's a great question and a loaded question. As of today, I would say it's still a bit more of a hindrance. And I'll give you an example. It's a virtual one, but anyways, let's just say in our neighborhood, most people have rooftop solar. My neighbor has an electric vehicle. He goes to work early in the day. They produce energy during the day, solar energy, that they cannot use. They feed it back into the grid. In the days of net metering slowly dying, it's not particularly lucrative. I'm working from home most of the time, so why couldn't they use some of the energy they are producing on their rooftop to actually charge my vehicle? And then maybe in the late afternoon, evening or so, it's payback time. We move it back. So I think that would be a very, very local use case for transactive energy. Just it's not really possible because we are stuck with net metering or any other feed-in tariff or compensation mechanism that the regulatory bodies have implemented. We would need to free that up. Very, very similar things about how do we deal with charging at the workplace? How do we transact energy that was generated on a local basis, whether it's a community or an individual residence or a commercial building or so. So freeing up those electrons that they can be traded differently, not just in a wholesale market, which is centrally administered for the entire state, which I don't think is reflective of what the market and what the technology is. Give you an example from the East Coast, the microgrid trial that we've seen in Brooklyn between Consensus, LO3 Energy, and I think there were a couple other players involved as well. That really showed where technology is headed. And that's not just for the rich neighborhoods, which can afford all those little toys. I think it's equally, if not more, applicable also to the less privileged areas in our cities, where community solar projects and so on could have a tremendous impact on the population. And their regulation really prevents a lot of those things from happening.
I guess the question off the back of that is, how quickly do we think that regulation is going to catch up with the technology right now?
Great question, and I'll answer it in a hopeful way.
Okay.
I'm just back from a conference up in Vancouver, Grid Forward, and one of the panelists there in a discussion was Commissioner Potter. Jenny Potter just recently joined the PUC for the state of Hawaii. And she was talking about radical changes, as right now most electricity utilities are regulated essentially based on the capital that they allocate. They earn a guaranteed return on the capital they allocate. And she said we need to break those mechanisms and instead reward other goals, other outcomes that are much more relevant in today's world. We know that the regulatory process is essentially a legal proceeding, so it will never happen overnight. But I think the awareness is there now. People recognize and accept that challenge and started working on it. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Great. And a final question from the floor, going back to the issue of transportation. So we've looked at some of those new mobility service providers. We've referenced Uber and Lyft, and this question pertains to them. So it says, is it inevitable that services like Uber and Lyft will continue to take away from public transportation? So I guess there's an assumption in the question that it is already taking away from public transportation. What are both of your thoughts on that question? I guess the evolution of these services within that city context.
No, it's not inevitable at all. In fact, we're already seeing clues to how this is likely to evolve. And so we will see a multimodal providers emerge. And so, as I referenced earlier, the consolidation of Uber buying Jump and Lyft buying Motivate to get into the biking space. I think ultimately we will see providers that have a consolidated platform across a variety of different modes of transportation, and the objective there will be to share a broader set of customer interests. A study has just come out. I think it was Uber, but it might have been Lyft, that reported the impact of their commute patterns once, I think it was Uber, once they bought Jump. And what they found is that there has been a 15% shift from car share usage into bike share once those two have come onto the platform. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we've seen is that as we have more shared transport for last mile usage, we see and increased usage of public transport. An example of this is through the data that is now publicly available through MoveIt. We see that in many cities, both in the United States and Europe, that the first and last mile constitutes over 50% of the commute time. And with the availability of better first and last mile solutions, we see more use of public transport. A good example of that is in Minneapolis, where when the bike share programs were married with or put next to the terminal stations at the trains, that the use of trains increased by 20 to 25%.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So in the same way as I might be an iPhone person and someone else swears by Android, do you see people living in their own mobility ecosystem? So someone's an Uber person, someone's a Lyft person, and you therefore take the modes of transportation that exist within those ecosystems. So you take the preferred Uber bikes and the Lyft person does that? Or do we see at some point some of these mobility service providers actually playing together? So Lyft's being available on Uber platforms, or is that making far too many assumptions that these people will work, the private entities will work together on a single platform as well?
We're seeing evidence, or at least as of now, that consumers are choosing the platforms and the alternatives that are most convenient. So an example of that is you'll see a couple walking, and then there might be a bird and a Lime bike next to each other, and one would take one and the other would take the other. So the other thing I expect that we'll see, and we've invested behind this, is the belief that there would be a separate platform for multimodal transport. And so we've invested in MoveIt with that view. And so I think what cities would prefer is that there be a single platform on which consumers and residents could go, and then there would be a variety of operational alternatives, transportation alternatives underneath that. And so certainly we're going to see Uber and Lyft try to be all things to all people, but I think in many cities we'll see a common digital platform with multiple operators underneath that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think Paul highlighted the key point there was multimodal and seamless. And from a consumer point of view, we've seen how it works with airline alliances and code sharing and so on and so on. It brings some advantages, but you're still stuck with some severe limitations, I would say. So from a consumer's perspective, as seamless as possible, and that's also in the best interest of the cities to optimize traffic flows, and that has to be real-time dynamic. And please don't end up with a situation where, depending on which city I'm in, I need to use a different app. And I think the market, Paul mentioned it before, consumers vote with their feet or with their wallets, and whatever apps they put on their phone. I think the consumers will just demand it and adopt it, and that's where the market will then ultimately go.
Brilliant.
Just one more comment on that is the wonderful thing about a market is that it's self-organizing, and so we've had debates with executives from our various companies, and one of I like their response is sometimes people will come in with preordained views as this is how it would work or should work, and I think the most forward-looking companies are saying we are focused on the consumer experience, and we will let the consumer decide what's best for them, and our job is to provide the offerings and the services that they want, and then we'll let the users decide that, and when we have open systems that permit that, we get what is called in economics revealed preference. As the consumers decide what they want, that helps then provide a feedback loop into the policies that would support that.
Brilliant. I think that's a fantastic place to leave our discussion today. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for any more questions. So thank you very much to everyone that's put their questions to panelists, and thank you very much, Paul and Gerd, for your insights today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But before we end, I just got a couple more things to tell you all about. We've got another webinar in our Impact Cities webinar series. It will be taking place on Wednesday, October 31st. It is titled "A Framework for the Future: an open smart city platform," which I think follows on very nicely from those closing comments from Paul just there. We're very pleased to say it will feature the City of Los Angeles' General Manager and CIO, Ted Ross, alongside the University of Southern California and the Knight Foundation. Do not worry, I will email you all listening with the details about this straight after the webinar, and you can register right there. I will also send you all of the recording from today's webinar so you can listen back and share with your teams. And finally, Paul and Gerd will both be speaking at Impact Cities, as I mentioned at the start, taking place at Las Vegas at the Mirage on December 4th and 5th. It is a brand new conference whose mission is to connect the investors, enterprises, cities, and tech leaders to discuss the impacts and opportunities shaping the future of urban innovation today. And many of the topics that we've discussed on today's webinar, we will discuss in much further detail over 2 days on a dedicated track all about the partnership and investments going into smart cities. For more information, please follow the details on your screen now. Plus, for all webinar listeners, we have a special discount code. So to get an additional $200 off all of your conference passes, just use the code IMPACTWEB. You see it on the screen right now when you register. And I'll give you a week to use this. It will run out at the end of next Friday. So for an extra $200, use the code IMPACTWEB, and that expires next Friday. I hope you can all join us in Las Vegas on the 4th and 5th of December. But thank you very much for listening today. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time for our next webinar. Thank you and have a great day.